What this safety program will present. We'll discuss the new pictographs and their labeling, new employee training requirements, the new safety data sheets examples and its components, the new HCS definitions, and an explanation of what hasn't changed in the new law. Part 1. Pictographs and their meanings. Okay, here we can see our first pictograph, which covers flammables, pyrophorics, self-healing, flammable gases, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Here we can see the symbol for explosives, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Here is the symbol for gases under pressure. Here is the pictograph for skin corrosion, burns, eye damage, and corrosive to metals. The symbol for oxidizers is shown here in this pictograph. In this slide, we see the symbol for acute toxicity, fatal or toxic. The symbol for health hazard, depicting carcinogens, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizer, a target organ toxicity, and aspirations toxicity is shown here. The pictograph, which is the exclamation mark, a new symbol just introduced with this standard, means an irritant, a skin sensitizer, acute toxicity, narcotic effects, a respiratory tract irritant, and is hazardous to the ozone layer. Part 2. HCS 2012 Employee Training under the new law. Components of employee training. The three ways of educating the worker: labels, training, and safety data sheets. All three components must be readily available to the OSHA representative, employees, or independent contractors. Multiple location businesses must have a copy of each location where the substances are present. Employers shall provide effective information and training on hazardous chemicals. Your supervisor or HR, human resources person, is best suited if the safety officer is not available. This training will cover your work area on your initial assignment and whenever a new chemical hazard is introduced that the employee has not encountered previously. chemical-specific information must always be available through labels and safety data sheets. Training should cover all categories of hazards, covering areas of toxicity, labeling, etc. Minimum training calls for the following. Number 1, methods and observations that may be used to detect the presence or release of hazardous chemicals. Number 2, the physical, health, and simple asphyxiation, combustible dust, and pyrophoric hazards, as well as hazards not otherwise classified. Number 3, measures that the company employees can take to protect themselves from these hazards, including specific procedures that the company has taken to protect the worker. Part 3, the new safety data sheet infos and existing information. The safety data sheet product identifier. This calls for a product identifier in the label along with other means of identification. It is recommended for the use of substance and restrictions. It calls for the name, address, telephone number of the manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party, as well as an emergency number if it's available. The new safety data sheet calls for, when a mixture is not classified, a statement must be made to that effect. It calls for the classification of the substance according to 1910-1200. It uses a signal word, a hazard statement, a symbol, or precautionary statement will be provided. This will include an ingredient where unknown toxicity is used in a mixture of greater than 1%. Substances must have a chemical name, a common name, synonyms, a CAS number, or other unique identifiers. They will list impurities and stabilizing additives. The previous requirements, plus a chemical name and the concentration of all ingredients which are classified as health hazards, should be in a composite information on mixtures section. The safety data sheet must state that they present a health risk below the cutoff or concentration limit. The exact amount should be stated unless it is a trade secret. The standard calls for a description of necessary measures subdivided into different routes of exposure, such as inhalation, skin and eye contact, and ingestion. Firefighting measures must have a suitable and unsuitable extinguishing media defined. Specific hazards arising from the chemical defined. Personal precautions are redefined, protective equipment is required, and emergency procedures are detailed. Methods and materials for containment and cleaning are also on the SDS. Handling and storage of regulated substances. Precautions for safe handling are redefined depending on the types and amount of substance that is regulated. Exposures, controls, and personal protection. The PEL, or Personal Exposure Limit, or TLV, Threshold Limit Value, have been redefined for certain substances, and appropriate engineering controls have been mandated. In some situations, we will find that exposure controls and personal protective equipment have been mandated, along with appropriate engineering controls whenever necessary. Stability and reactivity issues, chemical stability issues, the possibility of hazardous reactions, conditions to avoid, incompatible materials, and hazardous decomposition products are discussed in the physical hazards section. The ecological information is non-mandatory, but discusses ecotoxicity, degradability, bioaccumulative potential, and the mobility in the soil. Disposal considerations on the SDS plus transport information with the UN number and special precautions are discussed in the disposal considerations and transportation section. Transportation information should include the UN shipping name, the hazard class, packing group, environmental hazards, and bulk transport information. The new HCS 2012 definitions. A chemical means any substance or mixture of substances. Classifications mean to identify the relevant data regarding the hazards of a chemical, review the data, and decide if it's hazardous. Classification for health and physical hazards includes determination of the degree of hazard by comparing the data of health and physical hazards. Hazard category means a division of criteria within each hazard class. The hazard class means the nature of the physical or health hazard. A hazard not otherwise classified, or HNOC, means an adverse physical or health effect identified through the evaluation of scientific evidence. A hazard statement means a statement assigned to a hazard class or category that describes the nature of the hazard of a chemical, including the appropriate degree of hazard. A hazardous chemical means any chemical that is classified as a physical hazard, a simple asphyxiant, a combustible dust or pyrophoric gas, or hazard not otherwise classified. A health hazard means a chemical which has been classified as according to the hazardous effects of acute toxicity, skin corrosion, irritant, or serious eye damage. The label means the appropriate group of written, printed, or graphic information elements concerning the hazardous chemical that is affixed to printed or attached container document information. A label element means the specified pictograph, hazard statement, signal word, and precautionary statements for each hazard class and category. Mixture means a combination or solution composed of two or more substances in which they do not react. Physical hazard means a chemical that is classified as posing as one of the hazardous effects of explosive, flammable, oxidizers, pyrophoric, corrosive, self-heating, gas under pressure, or in contact with water emits hazards. Pictogram means a composition that may include a symbol plus other graphic elements with a border or background. Precautionary statement means a phrase that describes the recommended measures that should be taken to minimize, prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage and handling. Pyrophoric gas means a chemical in a gaseous state that will unite spontaneously in air at temperatures of 130 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Safety data sheet means a written or printed material containing hazardous chemicals that is prepared in accordance with UN specifications. Signal word means a word used to indicate the relative level of severity of a hazard and alert the reader to a potential hazard on the label. Simple asphyxiant means a substance or mixture that displaces oxygen in the ambient atmosphere and can cause oxygen deprivation in those exposed to, leading to unconsciousness and possibly death. Substance means a chemical element and their compounds in a natural state or obtained by any production process, including additive necessary to preserve the stability of the product and impurities from the process used. Part 5. Parts of HCS 2012 that are the same as HCS 1994. Labels on shipped containers. The chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor shall ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is labeled, tagged, and marked. Manufacturers, distributors need to know this. Where the chemical manufacturer or importer is required to label, tag, or mark the following information: product identifier, signal word, hazard statement, pictographs, precautionary statement, and the name, address, and telephone number of the manufacturer or distributor is required. HCS 12 labeling requirements require that every worker know where the safety data sheets are, as well as what the proper requirements are for labeling. Every label on the primary and secondary containers should contain the following elements: the specified pictogram, a hazard statement, signal word, and precautionary statement. Substances are mixtures that are labeled as to what percentage of the substances are mixed. HCS 2012, as HCS 1994, still calls for engineering to be the highest priority, then administrative, and then personal protective equipment. HAZCOM Safety Summary. The new standard calls for tougher labeling requirements, new pictographs for various substance properties, as well as new definitions for words such as chemicals or relabeling of safety data sheets. The new hazard category and class have been introduced into the safety data sheets. Non-mandatory environmental requirements are now on the new SDSs. The physical hazards and product identifier requirements for the safety data sheets have been strengthened. A new classification for health and physical hazards, including the determination of the degree of hazard by comparing the data of health and physical hazards. This new section will meet UN specifications. The new HCS standards makes allowances for trade sequences and substances on the SDS. The purpose and objective of HAZCOM have not changed. Only the methodology for implementing those activities has. A hazard statement means a statement assigned to a hazard class or category. This describes the nature of the hazard of a chemical, including where the appropriate degree of hazard is. A precautionary statement means a phrase which describes recommended measures that should be taken to prevent adverse effects resulting from the exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage handling. Part 1. Introduction to First Aid. Introduction to First Aid Kit. Rule number 1 is get all the help you can for first aid injuries, no matter how small those injuries first appear. It is very important for you to get immediate treatment for every injury, regardless how small you think that injury is. A basic first aid kit is designed for normal, low-risk work situations. Here are the contents of a basic first aid kit. We'll add 1 absorbent compress 4 by 8 inches, 16 adhesive bandages 1 by 3 inches, 1 adhesive tape 5 yards long, 10 antiseptic single-use packages, 6 burn treatment single-use packages, and eye coverings for 2 eyes. We'll also add 1 eye wash, that is 1 fluid ounce, 4 sterile pads 3 by 3, 2 pairs of medical exam gloves, 1 triangular bandage, 39 by 39 by 55. And remember, always use medical exam gloves when exposed to blood or other bodily fluids to help prevent the spread of blood-borne pathogens. Part 2, your workplace hazard assessment for proper first aid preparedness. Hazard assessment in the workplace. When you as an employer complete your hazard assessment for your work sites, you should assess the hazards for the types and quantities of supplies for your first aid kit. Remember, always use medical gloves when exposed to blood or other body parts. Here's some following information to provide you with some ideas for developing your first aid kit. Assessing your potential first aid injury potential begins with checking your surroundings for potential hazards. As you can see from this example, we have snakes, spiders, potentially infectious animals. Your potential hazards versus first aid kit consideration starts with fall hazards working from ladders or unknown terrain, which would need triangular bandages, ammonia inhalants, a thermal space blanket for shock, an arm or wire splint. Other potential hazards you may encounter are sunburn, which of course would use sunblock or burn cream, biting or stinging insects, which would require sting kill wipes, bee wasp spray, or meat tenderizer, sprains which would utilize elastic bandages or cold packs. Also included in our list of hazards would be snake bites, requiring a snake bite kit, Poison ivy, which would require calamine lotion. Poison oak, which would also require calamine lotion. Cuts, which could be solved by antiseptic swab, first aid ointments, compresses, elastic tape, scissors, towelettes, antibacterial wash, rubber gloves, and tweezers. Electric shock, which required a CPR kit as well as a thermal space blanket. Frostbite or hypothermia, which could require also a thermal space blanket. Splinters, which requires a first aid forceps as a solution. First aid hazards and solutions include amputation, which will require a plastic garbage bag, dehydration and heat stroke, requiring bottled water, and poisoning during pesticide spraying, which would necessitate an emergency or poison control center. Fractures will require a wooden or plastic splint, 1/4 inch by 3 by 12 to 15 inches, as well as an air inflatable roll or of elastic wrap. Seizures require tongue depressors. Electric shock requires dry, sterile dressing. Chemical burns require dry, sterile dressing and bottled water. Insects in your ear require mineral oil, and burns require flushing with water as well as covering with bandages. Part 3, the basic rules of first aid treatment. Comrades, remember, in many cases have been reported where small, unimportant injuries, such as a splinter wound or a puncture wound, quickly led to an infection. It is important that all of you get immediate treatment for every injury. Remember what George says, control bleeding with pressure. Bleeding is the most visible result of an injury. Each of us has 5 to 6 quarts of blood in our body. Most people can lose a small amount of blood with no problem. However, a quart or more is lost, it could quickly lead to shock and/or death. One of the best ways to treat bleeding is to place a clean cloth on the wound and apply pressure with the palm of your hand until the bleeding stops. You should also elevate the wound above the victim's heart, if possible, to slow down the rate of bleeding. First aid commandment, treat physical shock as quickly as possible. In all cases. When shock occurs, a major organ or tissue don't get enough oxygen. Shock can often threaten the victim of an injury if not treated quickly. Even if the injury doesn't cause death, the victim can go into shock and die. Shock often occurs when the body's important functions are threatened by not getting enough blood. Never move an injured person unless there is a fire or explosive are involved. The major concern with moving an injured person is the making the injury worse, which is especially true of spinal cord injuries. If you must move an injured person, try to drag him or her by the clothing around the neck or shoulder area. If possible, drag the person onto a blanket or large cloth and then drag that blanket to safety. Perform the Heimlich maneuver on choking victims. Ask the victim to cough, speak, or breathe. If the victim can do none of these, stand behind the victim, locate the bottom rib with your hand. Ask the victim to cough, speak, or breathe. If the victim can do none of those, of course, locate the bottom rib with your hand and proceed to help the victim. Place your other hand over your fist and press the victim's stomach with a quick upward thrust until the food is dislodged. Flush burns immediately with water whenever possible. Remember to flush the burn first. If the victim's clothing is stuck to the burn, don't try to remove it. Removing clothing that is not stuck to the burn is possible by cutting or tearing it. Cover the burn with clean cotton material. If you do not have any clean cotton material, do not cover the burn with anything. Do not scrub the burn and do not apply any soap, ointment, or home remedy. When administering CPR in the case of burn victims, remember, once the victim is stable, begin to run cold water over the burn for a minimum of 30 minutes. Next topic is handling heat stroke or heat exhaustion. Use cool treatment for either heat exhaustion or heat stroke. My fellow Americans, remember, heat exhaustion or heat stroke are two different things, although they are commonly confused as the same condition. Heat exhaustion can occur anywhere there is poor air circulation, such as around open furnaces or under heavy machinery, even if the person is poorly adjusted to very warm temperatures. The body reacts by increasing the heart rate and strengthening the blood circulation. Simple heat exhaustion can occur due to loss of body fluids and salts. The symptoms of heat exhaustion are usually excessive fatigue, dizziness, disorientation, and a normal skin temperature, but a damp but clammy feeling. To treat heat exhaustion, move the victim to a cool spot and encourage drinking cool water and rest. And now a few words about dealing with heat stroke, not to be confused with heat exhaustion. Heat stroke is much more serious and occurs when the body's sweat glands have shut down. Some symptoms of heat stroke are mental confusion, collapse, unconsciousness, and a fever with dry, mottled skin. Heat stroke victims will die quickly, so don't wait for medical help to arrive. Assist immediately. The first thing you can do is move the victim to a cool place out of the sun and begin pouring cool water over the victim. Fan the victim to provide good air circulation until medical help arrives. Each form of poisoning has to be handled on an individual basis. The first thing to do is get the victim away from the poison. Then provide treatment appropriate to the type of poisoning. If the poison is a solid form, such as pills, remove it from the victim's mouth by using a clean cloth wrapped around your fingers. After checking the area first for your safety, remove the victim from the area and take him or her to a fresh air. If the poison is corrosive to the skin, remove the clothing affected from the area and flush it with water. Try to stay calm when calling the doctor and use the appropriate steps as directed. First Aid Pre-Crisis Planning, Part 5. Your pre-first aid planning will include doing these steps before a first aid event. Inform your coworkers to get help for any injury or life-threatening situation. Complete a med card so first aiders can know how to handle your specific situation. Update your personal information and emergency contact information at least twice per year. No pre-event planning would be incomplete without knowing any medications that you or your coworkers are taking. Make a list of those items. Know who your CPR people are and keep them well trained. When the event happens, unneeded people need to stay out of the way. Pre-first aid events call for saying it's okay to call 911 more than once. Those not directly involved may need to direct emergency personnel to the location. And remember to respect the privacy of others. Pre-event planning calls for filling out a med card before an emergency to assist emergency personnel. Telling your coworkers about medications that you are taking. Filling in your first aid kit with items that address the hazards in your area. Knowing who your CPR or first aid personnel are. Updating your personal information at least twice per year. Handling emergency calls for handling shock victims only to move when the situation mandates it. Immediate action. Not confusing heat stroke with heat exhaustion. Handling each poison incident as a special situation, and knowing your poison hotline number. Flushing burn victims first when dealing with burn victims. Asking a potential choke victim to talk or speak before applying the Heimlich maneuver. Thanks for participating from the gentle folks of MySafetyTrainingOnline.com. My Safety Training Online presents personal protective equipment. Welcome. My Safety Training Online presents personal protective equipment. Welcome. What you will learn. Introduction to personal protective equipment. We'll talk about alternatives to personal protective equipment, examples of PPE, establishing a personal protective equipment program, injuries that occur without personal protective equipment, and the classes of hard hats. Let's get started. Introduction to Personal Protective Equipment. Employers must protect employees from workplace hazards such as machines, hazardous substances, and dangerous work procedures that can cause injury. Employers must use all feasible engineering and work practice controls first to eliminate and reduce the hazards. Then, when appropriate personal protective equipment is needed, in the event that those controls don't eliminate the hazards. Remember, PPE is the last level of control. The machine or work environment can be physically changed to prevent employee exposure to a potential hazard. Then, the hazard can be eliminated with an engineering control first and foremost. Initial design specifications: substitute less harmful material, change the process, enclose the process, isolate the process, or provide ventilation are all examples of engineering controls versus personal protective equipment. What are some of the causes of head injuries? Falling objects, bumping your head against fixed objects such as exposed pipes or beams. Contact with exposed electrical conductors. Employees can be removed from the exposure to potential hazards by changing the way they do their job. Then the hazard can be eliminated with a work practice control. Use wet methods to suppress dust. Personal hygiene, housekeeping and maintenance, job rotation. Personal protective equipment examples. Part 2. Examples of personal protective equipment. Well, for the eye would be safety glasses and goggles. Face would be face shields. Head would be hard hats. The feet, safety shoes. Hand and arms for gloves. And bodies with vests. Hearing, earplugs, and ear muffs. Made with metal or plastic safety frames, safety glasses at most operations require side shields. Used for moderate impact from particles produced from such jobs as carpentry, woodworking, grinding, and scaling. Protect your eyes, eye sockets, and facial area immediately surrounding the eyes from impact, dust, and splashes. Some goggles fit over corrective lenses. Widespread industrial uses as well as laboratories. Protect your eyes from burns caused by infrared or intense radiant light. And protect face and eyes. Sparks, metal splatter, slag chips produced during welding, brazing, soldering, and cutting. Laser safety goggles protect your eyes from intense concentration of light produced by lasers. Face shields protect the face from nuisance dust and potential splashes or sprays of hazardous liquids. What are some of the causes of head injuries? Falling objects, bumping head against fixed objects, such as exposed pipes or beams, or contact with exposed electrical conductors. Types of hard hats. Class A, general service, used in mining, building construction, shipbuilding, lumbering, and manufacturing. Good impact protection but limited voltage protection. Class B, electrical work protected from falling objects and high voltage shock and burns. They're used in the utilities industries and anywhere there are high voltage existing. Class C, designed for comfort, offering limited protection, protects your head against bumping against fixed objects, but does not protect against objects or electrical shock. Types of PPE hearing protection. earmuffs, earplugs, and canal caps. What are some of the causes of foot injuries? Heavy objects such as barrels or tools that might roll onto or fall on an employee's feet. Sharp objects such as nails or spikes that might pierce soles or uppers of ordinary shoes. Molten metal that might splash on the feet. Hot or wet surfaces, slippery surfaces are causes of foot injuries. Foot protection has high impact resistant toes and heat resistant seals that protect against hot surfaces common on roofing, paving, and hot metal industries. Some have metal insoles to protect against puncture wounds. Foot protection may be designed to be electrically conductive for use in explosive atmospheres or non-conductive to protect from workplace electrical hazards. Metatarsal protection is part of the shoes or strap to the outside of the shoes to protect the instep from impact and compression. What are some of the hand injuries you need to guard against? Burns, bruises, abrasions, cuts, punctures, fractions, amputations, and chemical exposures. Hand protection for personal protective equipment. Norfoil laminates resist permutation and breakthrough by an array of toxic hazardous chemicals. Butyl provides the highest permeation resistance to gas and water vapors and is frequently used for ketones such as methyl ethyl ketone and esters such as amyl acetate and ethyl acetate. The nature of the hazards and the operation to be performed will be determined your selection of gloves and work posts. The variety of potential hand injuries makes selecting appropriate pairs of gloves more difficult than choosing protective equipment. Take care to choose gloves designed for the particular circumstances of your workplace. Viton is a highly resistant to permeation by chlorinated and aromatic solvents. Nitrile provides protection against a wide variety of solvents, harsh chemicals, fats, and petroleum products, and also provides excellent resistance to cuts, snags, punctures, and abrasions. Kevlar protects against cuts, slashes, and abrasions. Stainless steel meshes protect against cuts and lacerations. What are some of the causes of body injuries? Intense heat, splashes of hot metal and other hot liquids, impacts from tools, machinery, and materials, as well as cuts, hazardous chemicals, contact with potentially infectious materials like blood or radiation. Protective equipment comes with a variety of materials, each suited for particular hazards. If there's a possibility of body injury still exists, provide protective equipment constructed of material to protect against specific hazards. Install feasible engineering controls and institute work practice controls to eliminate the hazards. Different materials will protect against different chemical and physical hazards. Conduct your hazard assessment and identify potential sources of bodily injury. Part 4. Establishing a Personal Protective Equipment Training Program. Establishing a program. Set out procedures for selecting, providing, and using personal protective equipment as part of the employee's routine operation. First, assess the workplace to determine if hazards are present and if likely to be present, which necessitate the use of personal protective equipment. Next, determine if those hazards can be administered, controlled, or engineered out. Once the proper personal protective equipment has been selected, the employer must provide training to each employee who is required to use the personal protective equipment. If their job specifications change, it affects the employees, they must be retrained. If the personal protective equipment changes, then the employee must be retrained. Employees required to use personal protective equipment must be trained at least knowing the following: when the personal protective equipment is necessary, what type is necessary, how to properly put it on, take it off, adjust it, and wear it, what the limitations of the personal protective equipment are, as well as proper care, maintenance, useful life, and disposal of the PPE. Each employer must assess the workplace of hazards, use engineering and work practice controls first to eliminate and reduce hazards before going to personal protective equipment, select the appropriate personal protective equipment from the hazards that cannot be eliminated, and inform employees why personal protective equipment is necessary and when it must be worn.